Sin of Omission is a kind of multi-layered novel, it seems to me. The central character, Stephen Malusi Mzimani, lives in the Eastern Cape in the mid-19th century. And the background is really important because the Xhosa people are starving. These are the years following the great cattle killing of the 1850s, 1856, 1857. And it's worth reminding ourselves what that entailed. Because the young visionary, Nonkoweze, told her people that if, and this was the potency of the promise, if they destroyed all their cattle, destroyed their granaries, and in a way repented, then the ancestors would return and the white settlers, this was the most potent of the promises, I think, would be driven back to where they belonged, back into the sea. And it was a prophecy which brought, of course, disaster on very many of the Xhosa people. And it's at that particular juncture, time of war, that the novel, as it were, begins. And I wanted to ask you about this young boy, the young boy who is adopted, as it were. And you say rather nicely, he was that rare creature, and I think of him as a black Englishman, but not just a black Englishman, but an Anglican minister, saved by the bishop and by the governor for the benefit of the empire. That is both his description and, of course, his dilemma. And it's his dilemma that grabs one right at the beginning. Did you have a sense that you were going to plunge this young creature so immediately into the kind of whirligig that was the war of those times and the frenetic atmosphere of in and around the Eastern Cape in the mid-19th century?
I want to go back to where I found the character himself, because he is based on a real person. When I was a young girl, I had a great uncle who'd been brought up on St. Matthew's Mission Station by his grandfather, my great-great-grandfather. And that relationship with him was very important to me. And he told me a story that his grandfather had told him about the mission station in the mid-19th century. And told me the story of this young man. And although I didn't really understand it or say much about it, it always remained in my remembrance. And many years later, when I was doing a commissioned history of a school in the Eastern Cape, I came across the records of the young men who had been taken in by, or the children that had been taken in during the cattle killing. In fact, parents had given up their children because otherwise they would have starved to death. And the missionaries were the people that would take them in. And of course, there was a political aspect to that as well, because the governor knew that this was playing into their hands, that they were getting these young men that could be Christianized, that could be educated, and then could go back perhaps to their communities with this empire education behind them. And he was one of them. And when I was doing that research for the school, I came across records of a young priest. And he so intrigued me by what was written in these records that I decided to follow up his story. And so many of what were called the Xhosa elite, who were the sons of chiefs and also the daughters, were sent to Zonneblom College in Cape Town and also to the Anglican Institution in Grahamstown to be groomed for empire, to go back to their people in a political sense, and many of them to be Christianized, and well, all of them to be Christianized, but to be sent perhaps to take holy orders. And this young man was one of those.
And this young Stephen is sent off, and indeed so well groomed once he's finished his time in Canterbury, that he is in effect, at least in the eyes of his colleagues in Canterbury, at least in England, an Anglican priest. When he gets back to South Africa, of course, when he gets back to the Eastern Cape, he is just another native. and the dilemma sharpens. Is that not so? Terrifically, the moment he arrives back, I think he no longer, he can't speak Xhosa any longer.
This is what came out of the research, because I was very lucky to have many letters written by different missionaries in the Eastern Cape to the United Society of the Propagation of the Gospel. And these young men, when they were on the mission stations, were more or less forbidden to speak Xhosa to each other. So he came in as a child of 9 as a Xhosa speaker. He hadn't forgotten it completely, but for most of his life, from the age of 9 until he was 20, he spoke English and was educated in English. I mean, I know at the Anglican institution, they did a lot of study of Shakespeare. The education was a first-class, fine English education. When he went to England, of course, he was something of a curiosity because he was a black man. But when he came back, and this is the tragedy of those who were educated in England, they were just seen as, what did they call them, boots and trousers natives. In other words, impertinent, difficult, and intractable, and probably seditious as well. And this is what he had to face. And when he came back, he was told that he would have one of the other students from Canterbury, one of the English students, would come with him, and that they would partner each other in a mission station. But when he came back, he found that he was going to be sent to a really isolated mission on his own, into a community which was extremely traditional. And of course, his Xhosa was rudimentary. He hadn't spoken it for so many years, and culturally, he had lost touch with his roots. And so for him, the isolation was absolutely extraordinary. And this comes through in the letters of the real person on whom I based my character.
What also comes through in the novel, and it strikes me very sharply, is the way in which you expose, and at times the novel, it seems to me, I mean, I think it's a number of things, but at times it's almost a withering satire on the muscular ignorance of the settlers whom this young priest has to suffer and whom he encounters. As somebody whose family comes from the Eastern Cape, it is at times deeply embarrassing to read, not because it's too far out, but because it's too close to the bone. And I wondered if you were aware of quite how you peel away the layers of pretension and sheer monumental foolishness to which many people from that part of the world and others were given.
During the research process, I had these wonderful letters. Some of them, I mean, many of them were really funny almost in the way they expressed themselves, the kind of pretensions that they had. Just for example, we have Little Grahamstown, which is Makanda, very small town at the time, Grahamstown, and there was such a division between the Anglican clergy. Those on West Hill were fine to preach because they were mostly Oxbridge. Those at the other side of town dropped their H's perhaps, so it wasn't quite appropriate for him to preach in a church was a quarter of a mile away. So these divisions, which sort of underline the class, that, you know, the attention to class, if you like, and the pretensions and the prejudices came through so strongly in the letters. And then, of course, when it came to speaking about Black parishioners or students or just the Black population in general, was this really primary source of extraordinary material that just showed at an absolutely gut level what people felt, how they expressed themselves. And of course, one doesn't have the reaction from the other side because there were not that many letters. But I think what also struck me is that how little actually often has changed, and that so many of the things expressed in those letters are still pertinent.
Oh, that's what strikes me about the book. It's as if, in a way, you could describe the novel as an historical saga. You could also describe it as a long meditation on the oddity that makes South Africans who they are.
Yes.
And you could also describe it, as I say, as a kind of merciless satire. I mean, you might almost say that when you talk about having excavated the material, the letters, looked at the attitudes of people at the time, you might almost say, as one reads through it, and Stephen's treatment by almost every other white person makes you wonder whether the British settlers had any saving graces whatever. And that's pointed up by the fact that the one good priest, if you like, the one good encounter he has with the minister who, in a sense, supports and understands him, that minister is not English at all, he's Irish.
Yes, and he suffered the kind of prejudice and that Stephen knew, and I base that quite specifically, again, on letters which were written by that particular priest. I changed his name, which showed a kind of kinship with those who were derided and were seen as different. And, you know, for me, actually writing that character was one of the great joys of doing this book.
I want to read something. It's just a couple of lines from the very, very first lines of the book. And the reason I want to read it is because among the other qualities the novel seems to me to have is it's capturing not only of the look and feel of the country at the time, but also of the atmospherics. I'll explain what I mean. This is how the novel opens. They have smashed the bells. All over Kaffraria, the sound has ceased. There is a great silence, more profound, more still than the dim before the dawn. A great conspiracy of emptiness, except for the sound of the wind, vaulting, powerful. Now, there are so many echoes. Those bells, of course, chime metaphorically or physically throughout the novel. You hear them at the beginning, or you don't hear them, or you hear the silence in which you might have heard them. And of course, you hear them as the novel concludes at the end. Again, they haunt the landscapes, almost as if you build a kind of soundscape as well as simply excavating the historical temper of the times. And I wondered if there was any intention in that, or whether it's just something that builds into your prose as you write.
As far as the bells were concerned, and I'd like to talk about those as well as the wind. First of all, anybody brought up in the Eastern Cape knows all about that. It is almost a sort of voice that comes from the interior, especially when there's a berg wind. But why I started the book with "They've Smashed the Bells" is that I came across a very, very small entry in an old diocesan record in which it said they have smashed the bells because the bells are the iron force, the iron tongue of God. And if you silenced that iron tongue, then you really didn't have to listen. The other thing is that it called people to prayer on Sundays. In traditional society, Sundays were still a day of work. It was not the day of prayer at that time. And it reminded one constantly of the presence of people that were trying to undermine the things like dancing, like singing, like hoeing in the fields, having a beer drink, all those things which reminded you also of sin, because I think that was one very, very important part of the bells, was that it was the voice that told you that the afterlife was more important and that what you were doing now was sinful. And how could it be considered sinful, what had always been part of the daily resonance of life in a society like that? And those bells also harnessed Stephen to times, to limits of time, which is something that is much more fluid, much more flexible within traditional society. And we, of course, are, constrained by time the whole time.
You introduce as well an interestingly modern note, in the sense that Stephen has a brother, Mzamo, who you could describe as a very modern young man. Because again, he's a kind of proto-Steve Biko. He's, in a sense, he grasps the future, whereas Stephen is destroyed by the present or his present circumstances. And I wondered about whether you intended to set up this rather interestingly sharp distinction between the two brothers in the way they saw each other and in the way they see the world and in the way they see South Africa.
Mzamo was a character who, again, in terms of the real historical context of the story, was real. The Stephen on whom I based my character had a brother, in fact, more than one brother, who was taken in for sedition and made to work on the breakwater in Cape Town after the 1878-79 war, the last frontier war. And I remember one very poignant letter that Stephen wrote to his superiors in England, saying that his heart was full of the deepest sorrow because his brother had died and had been arrested for sedition. And all through it came the very particular thing that Stephen was a Nika, that a particular branch of the Xhosa people. And he was in an Mfengu community, which was supposed to be loyal to empire, and in the last frontier war was, there were so many different complications, but the Amafengu and the Mangika were always in competition with each other. And he was put into the Mfengu community. But the real Stephen's brother was a Nika. He fought for them. He had been educated as well as Stephen had. He was a man of intelligence. I had very little background on him, but I know that when young men were taken, say, to Zonnebloem College or to the Anglican institution, those that showed any sort of spunk, let's put it that way, or who challenged the system, were very often just sent home because they weren't fitting into the mold. And I think I said somewhere in the book that Stephen had always been amenable. He was not. He wasn't confrontational, and Mzamo was the brother who had, in his eyes anyway, more talent, more assertiveness than he did, and he was chosen in his stead. And these stories of the young men who, in fact, bucked the system or who challenged the system were very often sidelined because they weren't amenable.
Tell me about your take on the women in the book, because they seem to me, Elizabeth Madikani and Lily Majola, that they seem unlike almost all the others in that they, to me anyway, represent a certain sense of goodness, almost a kind of sense of redemption, which none of the other characters have, except perhaps for the Reverend Turley, the Irish minister, who is a positive force. But they seem in many ways quite apart. Did you draw on material for them, or are they your invention?
They are. There's two sides to that again as well. Just to give you a little bit of background on Elizabeth Madikane, a number of years ago, I was in London and I went to an exhibition of Black Victorians at a small gallery, and I'm sure you've seen those pictures, Christopher. They're now in the National Portrait Gallery, but they were taken of what was known as the Zulu Choir. Now, that was where the fiction came in. That choir went to England quite a long time after where I have set, in the 1890s, so after where I have set the story. But what was so striking about that was these incredible portraits, these beautiful portraits which had been taken of these people who had come to England to sing. They were all very much part of the church, but they were made to sing many of their songs sort of in tribal dress and to do the whole African, slightly savage thing, which was wanted people wanted to see in England.
Oh.
But when I was at that portrait gallery, there was this picture of an extraordinarily beautiful woman with an amazingly serene face. And she just inspired me to make a character of her. But there was another part of the gallery as well, where there were pictures, mostly contact prints from old albums, which had been gathered together. And there was a terribly small picture of a young man in his suit with his hat and his cane on a chair with this sort of Italianate background. And it said Canterbury 1868 on it and gave the name of the studio. And I just sensed somehow that really was Stephen, because I have only ever seen a very grainy photocopy of him. But it was exactly the time that he was here. It wasn't a face of one of the other students which I have seen. And somehow I felt that this was something that I could hook the story onto, because very importantly is Stephen's emotional life in the book as well. And this woman had been taken out of her context, and he had been taken out of his context. And somehow something about who she was and what she must have experienced became very important and internal to him. And that's the fiction part of the story. But Lily Majola, who you spoke of, I did a lot of research on the young mission women at St. Matthew's Mission at Holy Trinity, where I set the novel. And these young women were there, and their grace somehow was something that I wanted to write about. And knowing that Stephen's longing for love, which had been denied him because of the rules about circumcision, and she was a traditional woman and so was her family, made it impossible to go across that divide without enormous pain or difficulty for both of them and for the families concerned.
Indeed, and you put that extremely well, and it is perhaps one of the most moving things in the book. It's the unattainability of all that he loves, which strikes one. It's also the price you pay for the kind of transformation that both she and he underwent, and that's very striking. And it leads me to another question, and it's this. And I know the reviews have been very good, and they deserve to be. But I wondered if you've had any pushback from people who feel that it is illegitimate to write from the point of view of somebody from an entirely different ethnic background. And there's a great deal of that about. But I wondered if you'd come up against that, or what you felt about it.
Fortunately, I haven't come up against it, for which I'm extremely grateful. And I had support from, as you've probably seen on the book, from very important and sensitive people from that community, from the Archbishop and from Dr. Magona. I haven't had pushback, and I did expect it, and was very, very sensitive and aware of the fact that even embarking on the book was a dangerous thing to do. I mean, to write outside one's gender, one's race, one's time is extremely difficult. In South Africa particularly, I mean, you know this yourself, an extremely sensitive thing. And if I have criticism for it, I will understand it. But when I went into it, I thought, this man who I had heard about from the time I was a little girl, and everything that I have ever done in my own professional life has been quite closely linked to African languages, to culture, to that sort of thing. I felt that if the story wasn't told, who was going to tell it? He was such an obscure person. I found him in such an obscure place that not to have told that story, and even if I get criticism for it, and I am perfectly willing to take it, a novelist writes a story, they write it from their experience, they write it from the research, and they just simply do their best. And I had magnificent research material. So in each part of the book where people speak, a great deal of it actually comes from primary source. So if there is criticism, I understand it. But the other thing was, and I mean, this sounds perhaps a bit over the top, but Stephen, the real Reverend Mnyagama, was my great-great-grandfather's assistant. And my great-great-grandfather wrote about him with warmth and with great approbation. And I felt, as his descendant, if anybody was going to write it out of the culture, and the story would have been lost perhaps otherwise, then perhaps I could dare to do it. And I did.
I think that when I used the word earlier, that it struck me, among other things, as being as much a long meditation as a novel. Of course, that begs a certain question, and that is, which I put to myself, upon what is it meditating? And it seems to me that the other extraordinary challenge the reader faces is the question as to whether it is ever possible, given the South Africa we know, for people of different ethnic backgrounds, different races, different historical perspectives, ever to understand each other. Because in a sense, what destroys Stephen as much as anything is not the overt cruelty and the stupidity of those around him. It is the fact that it is very, very complicated, and it goes back a long way. And as somebody once said, it's very complicated, and if you don't understand the depth of the problem in South Africa, you don't understand the question. And that seems to me to come across again and again. This unasked but hovering question. Well, because in a way, Stephen's brother, Stephen seems to stand in a curious way for a certain sort of racial amity, a certain sort of peace, a certain sort of non-violent faith. His brother stands for the future. And of course, there's a marvelous moment at the end of the book, an absolutely wonderful moment, I think, when guns keep being hidden. There's a rifle that is hidden at the beginning of the book, which belongs to Stephen's father, an old relic, but nonetheless a weapon of war. There is a rifle hidden at the end of the book. And where is it hidden? It's hidden by Stephen. It belongs to his brother, or his brother wants it back. But where's Stephen hidden it? He's hidden it in his library. He's hidden it behind a copy of Euclid, a Greek mathematician, and Virgil, a Roman poet. So here you have, I thought it was a wonderful touch. You have this weapon of war, which points, I fear, towards the future, frankly. And after all, the period in which you are describing, nothing but war dominates. It is one border war after the next, one damn thing after another. So I wondered, and there's no resolution to the question. The question is very, very powerfully put. What you seem to do is open up these possibilities of these lives and say, well, this is how we are, this is where we have been, and it looks to me, very difficult to say with any sort of equanimity, but ala sarakum, because that is not the message you take away at the end of the book.
No, it wasn't the message that I could give, because I don't know. And, that's what we're wrestling with now at this time, and especially at this time where, the whole world is in a state of acute anxiety and discombobulation, if you like, because of what, is going to happen. And in South Africa, and I think you bring this out very clearly in your writing as well, is that the complexities are so huge. Are we able to deal with them as individuals and as society? It's just one of those incredibly difficult things. But I think for Stephen, and I think you have said this as well, I mean, and it's very important that he says at the end that his faith actually is the thing that is one thing that stands with him, despite the interpretations of faith because there is faith as well on the other side in the traditional religion, and he has to make compromises with both of those. But his faith does in fact remain firm. As far as Mzamo is concerned, I wanted to speak about him because I drew on him very much from the young men who were involved with newspapers at that time, the black press, who really did have a voice, and whose voice after the Second Anglo-Boer War was just so massively repressed. Before that time, there was quite a groundswell of protest, of debate, and of anger that could be expressed. And Mzamo was part of that period, and those young men who, of course, after that war, as Milner said, we will sacrifice the nigger completely. And, you know, that's what happened.
That's what happened. I think on that note, we'll leave it. I would add only one thing, which is, as a South African, I'm reminded of that remark once somebody made about the politics of Northern Ireland, that if you think you understand, you're deeply confused. And
yes.
It's the confusion that I always think about. Thank you very much, Margaret.
It was wonderful talking to you. Thank you, Christopher. Carol and I have known each other for a long time and worked on another project together. And for me, it's just the most wonderful thing to have been part of the Kaskom art project. And I asked her if she would read the manuscript and see what she felt about illustrating it. And it's been the most wonderful collaboration with fantastic embroiderers. I want to say Tebo Mvubu and Noseti Makubalo, all of those who were involved with it. Then they did the most beautiful work. And we took those tapestries to Nonjola, to Holy Trinity Church, where now it's, for me, one of the most wonderful things is that the congregation there today know about Stephen and honor him, and it's brought part of their history back to that community. And when the people visited from Kaskom Art Project and saw their work, their handwork, and then did these tapestries, it was a moment of great joy and interest to everybody. And so somehow it brought Stephen home, and for me that was a very important part of the whole process of the journey, if you like, of writing this book and launching it. But just going to the Walter Scott Prize, it's funny, I remember my grandmother, who was Scottish, always had a wonderful collection of Scott's novels. I fear that I didn't read them, but the prize has been going since 2010 and has been awarded to a South African before. And there has been a great interest more recently in South African literature. I know, Christopher, you and I went through the very hard times when books particularly were not from here, were not much looked at in England and places like that. Anyway, to have been put on that shortlist means a huge amount to me. And I think a lot of it has to do also with Carol's work, with me, and just the interest now in South African history. So I was very honored to be there. I certainly didn't expect to win, but it was great to be on that shortlist. Sorry, there's somebody whose name I see there, Francis Wilson. And I just need to say that his incredible mentorship to me, when doing this research, has been hugely appreciated, as well as the immense support I had from someone called Bruce Howard, who got all the research for me from the United Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And for me, so much of writing this book has been, in a sense, a team effort, because it's the marvelous academic research that so many other writers and academics have done that has been of the most enormous help and inspiration to me. And to talk to Christopher and to be interviewed by you, Christopher, is really a great honor, and it's been wonderful being with you.
It was lovely talking to you. Thank you very much, Marguerite.
Thank you.